You know that moment when someone you care about looks you straight in the eye and tells you that everything you've accomplished, every lesson you've learned, every battle you've fought to get where you are, means absolutely nothing? That they know better than you, despite having lived half your years and faced a fraction of your challenges? I'm Pauline Turner, and I'm 72 years old. For most of my adult life, I've been underestimated, overlooked, dismissed as just another elderly woman who should stick to knitting and watching soap operas. But what people don't see, what they refuse to acknowledge, is the empire I built from nothing. The investments I made when everyone said I was crazy. The risks I took when others played it safe. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My story isn't just about money, though that's certainly part of it. It's about respect. It's about the dangerous assumption that age equals irrelevance. And it's about what happens when the very person who mocked your wisdom comes crawling back, desperate for the expertise they once ridiculed. This is the story of how my son-in-law learned the hardest lesson of his life, and how I discovered that sometimes the greatest victory isn't in proving you're right. It's in choosing to be gracious when you could destroy someone with a single word. The crystal chandelier in my daughter Sarah's dining room cast warm shadows across the mahogany table as we gathered for what had become our monthly family dinner. It was November, and the Seattle rain drummed steadily against the floor-to-ceiling windows of their modern home in Bellevue. I had arrived early, as was my habit, carrying a bottle of wine from my personal collection and the homemade apple pie that had become my signature contribution to these gatherings. Sarah was in the kitchen, her blonde hair pulled back in the same practical ponytail she'd worn since high school, though now at 38, fine lines had begun to appear around her green eyes. My eyes, passed down through generations of Turner women. She moved with practiced efficiency, checking the roast, adjusting the table settings, playing the perfect hostess role she'd mastered since marrying David 3 years ago. My son-in-law emerged from his home office just as I was settling into my usual chair at the head of the table. David Chen was an impressive figure at first glance, tall, lean, with the kind of confident stride that came from an Ivy League education, and the assumption that the world owed him success. At 42, he carried himself like a man who had never truly failed at anything, which I suspected was about to become his greatest weakness. "Pauline," he said, his tone cordial but distant as he took his seat across from me. "How's retirement treating you?" I smiled, the same polite smile I'd perfected over decades of dealing with condescending men in boardrooms. "Quite well, thank you. I've been keeping busy with my investments." Sarah emerged from the kitchen carrying the roast, her face slightly flushed from the heat. Mom's being modest. She just closed another deal last week. Something about renewable energy stocks. David's eyebrows rose slightly, but I caught the subtle smirk that played at the corners of his mouth. "Still playing the market, I see. That's nice. A good hobby for someone your age." The word hobby hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that came whenever someone reduced my life's work to a pastime, but I kept my expression neutral. After all, I'd been hearing variations of this dismissal for 50 years. "It keeps me engaged," I replied simply, cutting into my meat with deliberate precision. As dinner progressed, the conversation meandered through the usual topics: Sarah's work at the nonprofit, plans for the holidays, the latest renovations to their house. But I could sense tension beneath the surface. David kept checking his phone, his jaw tight with the kind of stress that comes from problems money can't immediately solve. Sarah's bright chatter had a forced quality, like someone trying to maintain normalcy while walking on thin ice. Finally, during dessert, David's facade cracked. "I don't know what we're going to do," he said, pushing his plate away half-finished. "The Johansson Group pulled their funding yesterday. Just like that." 18 months of negotiations gone. Sarah reached across the table to squeeze his hand. We'll figure it out. You always do. David shook his head, running his fingers through his perfectly styled black hair. This is different, Sarah. This isn't some minor setback. Without that, funding, TechFlow Solutions is dead in the water. 2 years of development, 12 employees, everything I've worked for since leaving Microsoft. I had been quietly observing this exchange, my trained eye catching details that others might miss. The way David's hands trembled slightly when he mentioned the lost funding, the dark circles under his eyes that expensive concealer couldn't quite hide, the fact that he'd barely touched his wine, suggesting his stress was beyond what alcohol could numb. What exactly does TechFlow Solutions do? I asked, genuine curiosity in my voice. David looked at me as if he'd forgotten I was there. It's a B2B software platform. We streamline data integration for mid-market companies. Very technical stuff, probably not something you'd understand. The dismissal was casual, almost reflexive, but it landed like a slap. Sarah shot her husband a warning look, but the damage was done. I set down my fork and folded my hands in my lap, a gesture my late husband Richard used to say meant I was about to deliver a verdict. I see, I said calmly. And what's your customer acquisition strategy? Are you focusing on horizontal, expansion across industries, or are you going vertical within specific sectors? The question hung in the air, and I watched David's expression shift from condescension to surprise to something approaching respect. But it was fleeting. Like I said, it's pretty complex. The business development side requires understanding of contemporary market dynamics. Things have changed a lot since your day. Since my day. As if I were a relic from the age of slide rules and typewriters, rather than a woman who had been actively investing and advising companies well into the digital age. As if the principles of business, understanding your market, managing cash, flow, building relationships, adapting to change, had somehow become obsolete the moment I reached Medicare age. I took a sip of wine, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah was looking between her husband and me with growing unease, clearly sensing the undercurrent of tension, but unsure how to address it. David, I said finally, my voice carrying the authority I'd learned to project in countless boardrooms. I've been in business for over 40 years. I've seen companies rise and fall through recessions, market crashes, and technological revolutions. I've watched brilliant minds fail because they confused innovation with sustainability, and I've seen simple ideas become billion-dollar enterprises because someone understood the fundamentals. I paused, watching his face. The polite mask was slipping, revealing something closer to irritation. The fact that your funding fell through after 18 months of negotiations suggests either a fundamental flaw in your business model, unrealistic projections that couldn't withstand due diligence, or a failure to properly manage investor relationships. Which is it? The room went silent, except for the rain pattering against the windows and the distant hum of the dishwasher. Sarah had gone pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of mortification and fascination. David's face had darkened, his composure finally cracking. "With all due respect, Pauline," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "this isn't some mom-and-pop operation or real estate flip. This is sophisticated technology in a rapidly evolving market. The challenges we're facing require understanding of SaaS metrics, product market fit, venture capital dynamics, things that didn't exist when you were active in business." The word active carried the weight of a gravestone inscription. As if my business acumen had died along with my husband, as if my capacity for strategic thinking had withered with my youth. I felt the familiar burn of anger in my chest, the same fire that had fueled me through decades of being underestimated, overlooked and dismissed. But this time, it wasn't some stranger in a board meeting or a condescending banker. This was my daughter's husband, the man she loved, sitting at her table and telling me that my life's work was irrelevant, that I was irrelevant. "I see," I said, my voice dropping to the dangerous quiet that my business associates used to call the Turner tone. "So my 40-plus years of building businesses, managing investments, and creating wealth are irrelevant because I don't understand the complexities of your modern world. Is that what you're saying?" David had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, but he doubled down. "I'm saying that the business landscape has changed dramatically. What worked 20 or 30 years ago doesn't apply anymore. The pace of innovation, the capital requirements, the competitive dynamics, it's a completely different game now." Sarah finally found her voice. "David, maybe we should—" "No, Sarah," I interrupted gently but firmly. "Let him finish. I want to understand exactly what he thinks I don't comprehend about modern business." David straightened in his chair, his MBA training apparently kicking in. "Look, I respect what you accomplished in your time. But SaaS businesses operate on completely different metrics than traditional companies. We're talking about monthly recurring revenue, customer lifetime value, churn rates, network effects. The fundraising process alone involves term sheets, liquidation preferences, board composition, concepts that simply weren't part of the business world when you were building your career." I nodded slowly, as if absorbing this revelation. Fascinating. And these concepts, monthly recurring revenue, customer lifetime value, these are new inventions? The idea of understanding how much a customer is worth over time, or ensuring steady income streams? These weren't concerns for businesses in my day? "Well, no, but—" "And the fundraising process you mentioned, with investors examining your business model, your projections, your management team? This is also a modern innovation? The concept of due diligence, of investors wanting to understand risk and return? This didn't exist when I was raising capital for my ventures?" David's confident expression began to waver. "It's more sophisticated now. The level of analysis, the speed of decision-making." "The speed of decision-making," I repeated. "Interesting. So, when I built my first company from my kitchen table, in 1985, when I had to convince skeptical bankers to lend money to a 35-year-old widow with no collateral except her ideas, that was somehow less challenging than what you're facing? When I had to adapt to the personal computer revolution, the internet boom, the dot-com crash, 9/11, the 2008 financial crisis, all while growing my businesses and supporting my family, that was easier than navigating today's market? The cease. Room had grown very quiet. Sarah was staring at her hands, and I could see David beginning to realize he might have misjudged the conversation. But I wasn't finished. "Tell me, David, what exactly is your customer acquisition cost? And don't just give me the number. Explain how you calculated it and why it's sustainable in your market." He hesitated. "We're still refining those metrics." "I see. And your burn rate versus your runway. How many months of operation? Do you have left at your current spending level?" Another pause. "The funding situation has created some complications in our projections." "Of course it has. And your competitive differentiation, what exactly do you offer that your competitors don't, and how sustainable is that advantage?" David's silence stretched long enough to become an answer in itself. I took another sip of wine, letting the weight of his inability to answer fundamental business questions settle over the table. "Here's what I think happened," I said finally, my voice calm and measured. "I think you built a product that solves a real problem, which is good. But I think you assumed that having a good product was enough, which is where you went wrong. I think you got caught up in the romance of being an entrepreneur, the excitement of disrupting an industry, without doing the unglamorous work of building a sustainable business model." I set down my wine glass and looked directly at him. I think you focus so much on impressing investors with your technical capabilities that you forgot to prove you could actually make money. And I think when the Johansson Group's due diligence team started asking the hard questions about customer acquisition costs, retention rates, scalability challenges, you didn't have convincing answers. David's face had gone pale, and Sarah was looking between us with growing alarm. But I had reached the point where politeness mattered less than truth. Furthermore, I continued, I think you're so convinced that your generation invented business intelligence that you can't imagine learning from someone who's been successfully building and scaling companies since before you were born. You see my age and assume obsolescence, rather than recognizing experience. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 72 years in my joints, but keeping my posture straight and my voice steady. You're right about one thing, David. The business world has changed. Technology has accelerated everything. Global competition has intensified, and access to capital has created opportunities that didn't exist in my early career. But the fundamentals haven't changed. Success still requires understanding your customers, managing your resources, adapting to market conditions, and building sustainable competitive advantages. It still requires humility to learn from those who've walked the path before you. I picked up my purse from the counter, my movements deliberate and dignified. Sarah stood as well, her face flushed with embarrassment and confusion. Mom, please don't leave like this, she said, her voice small and pleading. I'm not leaving in anger, sweetheart, I said, touching her cheek gently. I'm leaving because I've been told my perspective has no value here, and I've learned over the years not to waste my time where it isn't wanted. I turned back to David, who was still sitting at the table, his earlier confidence completely deflated. I hope you figure out your funding situation. I genuinely do. Not for your sake, but for Sarah's. She deserves a husband who can provide stability, just as she deserves a mother-in-law who knows when to step back. As I walked toward the door, I heard Sarah whisper urgently to her husband, but I couldn't make out the words. The rain had intensified, and I stood for a moment in their foyer, looking out at the dark street where my driver was waiting. Pauline, David called out behind me. I turned to see him standing in the doorway between the dining room and the entryway, his expression somewhere between defiant and apologetic. For what it's worth, he said, I do respect what you've accomplished. But this situation with TechFlow, it's more complicated than you understand. The stakes are higher, the timeline is tighter, and the solutions require expertise in areas that require current market knowledge. I studied his face for a long moment, seeing the fear beneath the bravado, the desperation he was trying so hard to hide. Part of me, the part that remembered being young and proud and terrified of failure, wanted to soften my words, to offer comfort instead of challenge. But a larger part of me, the part that had fought for respect in every boardroom, every negotiation, every business relationship for 5 decades, wouldn't allow it. David, I said quietly, the day will come when you realize that your current market knowledge isn't enough. When you understand that all the technical expertise in the world can't substitute for wisdom earned through experience. When you discover that the people you've dismissed as irrelevant might be the only ones who can help you. I paused, my hand on the door handle. I hope, for your sake and Sarah's, that when that day comes, you'll have the humility to ask for help. And I hope the people you've underestimated will be gracious enough to give it. The drive home through the rain-slicked streets of Seattle gave me time to process what had just happened. My driver, Marcus, caught my eyes in the rearview mirror and must have seen something in my expression because he didn't attempt conversation. He'd been driving me for 8 years and had learned to read my moods. As we pulled into the circular driveway of my home in Madison Park, I sat for a moment looking at the house Richard and I had bought 30 years ago. It was a modest place by neighborhood standards, a craftsman-style home with a view of Lake Washington, surrounded by gardens I'd tended for decades. Not ostentatious, but comfortable. Successful without being showy. Much like the life I'd built. Inside, I poured myself a glass of the good whiskey, the bottle I saved for nights when I needed to think, and settled into Richard's old chair by the fireplace. The house felt larger in the evenings, filled with memories of conversations and laughter that had sustained me through the 3 years since his passing. I thought about David's words, about the dismissal that had become so familiar I'd almost stopped noticing it. Almost. The assumption that age equals irrelevance, that experience is somehow less valuable than energy, that wisdom can't coexist with innovation. I'd built my first company in 1985 with $15,000 borrowed against our mortgage and an idea for improving inventory management systems for small retailers. Richard had thought I was crazy to risk our home on an unproven concept, but he'd supported me anyway. That company had sold for $2 million in 1991, providing the capital for my next venture. Over the following decades, I'd started, grown, and sold 6 companies. I'd weathered the dot-com crash by diversifying into real estate. I'd navigated the 2008 financial crisis by shorting overvalued mortgage securities and buying undervalued tech stocks. I'd adapted to every technological revolution, every market shift, every change in business practices. But somehow, reaching the age of 72 had made all of that irrelevant in the eyes of people like David, as if my brain had suddenly stopped functioning the moment I qualified for Social Security. I took a sip of whiskey and pulled out my tablet, accessing the research files I'd been quietly compiling for the past 6 months. Because the truth was, I knew far more about TechFlow Solutions than David realized. I knew about their customer acquisition challenges, their retention problems, their technology gaps. I knew about the 3 competitors who were gaining market share while David focused on feature development instead of business fundamentals. Most importantly, I knew about the opportunity he was missing, the one that could save his company, if he had the vision to see it and the humility to accept guidance. But humility, I reflected, was often the hardest lesson for the young and brilliant to learn, especially when it meant acknowledging that someone from a previous generation might have something valuable to offer. My phone buzzed against the side table. A text from Sarah. "Mom, I'm so sorry about tonight. David didn't mean what he said. He's just stressed about the business. Please don't be angry with us." I stared at the message for a long time before responding, "I'm not angry, sweetheart. I'm disappointed, but I love you both, and I hope things work out for the best." It was true. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger was exhausting, and I'd learned long ago that it rarely solved problems. But I was disappointed, not just in David's dismissal of my experience, but in my daughter's inability to defend me when I needed her support. Still, they were family. And family, I'd always believed, deserved forgiveness even when they didn't deserve respect. What David didn't know, what Sarah didn't know, was that I'd been watching TechFlow Solutions from the moment David had started the company. I'd monitored their progress, tracked their competitors, analyzed their market position. Not out of nosiness, but out of the protective instinct that comes with loving someone, even when they don't appreciate it. I knew about their upcoming product launch, the one that could make or break the company. I knew about the patent application they'd filed and the technology gap they were struggling to bridge. I knew about the potential partnership opportunity with a major client that could provide the revenue stream they desperately needed. I also knew that without proper guidance, they were going to fail. Not because their technology was bad, but because they were making fundamental business mistakes that experience could have helped them avoid. The question was whether I should continue to watch from the sidelines or whether I should find a way to help despite being told my assistance wasn't wanted. I finished my whiskey and closed my eyes, listening to the sound of rain against the windows and the distant hum of the city beyond. Tomorrow, I would make some calls, do some research, explore some options. Because regardless of what David thought about my relevance to modern business, I had learned one lesson that transcended generations. Sometimes the best way to prove your worth isn't to demand recognition, but to quietly demonstrate value when it matters most. And I had a feeling that moment was coming sooner than David realized. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, typical Seattle weather for November. I was in my home office by 7, coffee steaming beside my computer as I reviewed the notes I'd compiled on TechFlow solutions. The room was Richard's former study, lined with books on business strategy, economic theory, and market analysis. His presence still lingered here, in the worn leather chair behind the desk and the fountain pen he'd given me for our 20th anniversary. I opened my secure investment account and scrolled through my portfolio. The renewable energy stocks Sarah had mentioned represented only a fraction of my holdings. Most people, including my own daughter, had no idea of the wealth I'd accumulated over 5 decades of careful investing and strategic business decisions. I preferred it that way. Wealth, I'd learned, was like power, most effective when wielded quietly. My phone rang, interrupting my review of TechFlow's competitive landscape. The caller ID showed Linda Morrison, my attorney and longtime friend. Pauline, Linda's voice was warm but concerned. Sarah called me last night. She said there was some kind of disagreement at dinner with David. I sighed, settling back in my chair. Linda had been handling my legal affairs for 20 years and had become one of my closest friends after Richard's death. She was one of the few people who understood both my business acumen and my complicated relationship with my family. David informed me that my business experience is irrelevant to modern commerce, I said dryly. Apparently, 40 years of building successful companies doesn't qualify me to understand the complexities of his software startup. Ah, Linda said, and I could hear the understanding in her voice. The age dismissal. You'd think by now people would have learned not to underestimate Pauline Turner. You'd think so, but apparently, reaching Medicare age has rendered me incapable of understanding concepts like customer acquisition and cash flow management. Linda was quiet for a moment. How are you handling it? It was a loaded question. Linda knew me well enough to understand that I didn't simply accept dismissal gracefully. I'd spent too many years fighting for respect in a male-dominated business world to quietly retreat when challenged. I'm considering my options, I said carefully. Pauline. Her tone carried a warning. Don't do anything that will damage your relationship with Sarah. I would never hurt my daughter intentionally, but I also won't pretend that her husband's behavior is acceptable. What's your plan? I looked out the window at the lake, where early morning joggers were making their way along the waterfront path despite the light rain. I'm going to do what I've always done when facing a challenge. I'm going to gather information, analyze the situation, and determine the best course of action. And if that course of action involves proving David wrong, then I'll prove David wrong, but I'll do it in a way that helps rather than hurts. After hanging up with Linda, I spent the next 2 hours deep in research. I used my network of contacts to gather intelligence on TechFlow's financial situation, their market position, and their competition. What I discovered was both worse and better than I'd expected. The company was indeed in serious trouble. Their cash flow was negative, their customer churn rate was climbing, and they had less than 4 months of operating capital remaining. The loss of the Johansson Group funding had been a critical blow, leaving them scrambling for alternative sources of investment. But I also discovered something David apparently hadn't realized. Their technology, while not revolutionary, was solid. More importantly, they were positioned to capitalize on an emerging market trend that their competitors were overlooking. With the right guidance and sufficient capital, TechFlow could not only survive, but thrive. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very experience David had dismissed as irrelevant was exactly what his company needed to navigate their current crisis. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 6 months. Peterson Ventures. This is James. James, it's Pauline Turner. I hope you're well. Pauline, what a pleasant surprise. It's been too long. What can I do for you? James Peterson was a venture capitalist I'd worked with on several deals over the years. His firm specialized in mid-stage technology companies, exactly the type of business TechFlow represented. I'm looking for information on a company called TechFlow Solutions. I understand they've been seeking funding. TechFlow? Yes, we looked at them a few months ago. Interesting technology, but some concerns about their business model and management. Team, why do you ask? Personal interest. What were your specific concerns? James was quiet for a moment. In our business relationship, I'd never asked for information without having a strategic reason. The usual suspects for a startup at their stage: customer acquisition costs were high, retention rates were declining, and their projections seemed optimistic given market conditions. The CEO seemed knowledgeable about the technology but less experienced with scaling operations. I see. Are you still considering them? Not actively. We passed on the current funding round, but we'd potentially reconsider if they addressed our concerns and brought in more experienced management. After the call, I sat back in my chair and considered the situation. TechFlow was viable, but needed expertise they didn't currently possess. David was technically competent, but lacked the business experience to scale the company. The solution was obvious to anyone with experience in turnaround situations. The question was how to implement that solution when the person who needed help had explicitly rejected my offer of assistance. I spent the afternoon making more calls, gathering additional intelligence, and formulating a strategy. By evening, I had a clear picture of both the problem and the potential solution. I also had the beginning of a plan that would either prove my relevance or confirm David's assessment of my obsolescence. That night, I called Sarah. "Hi, Mom." Her voice was subdued, still carrying the weight of the previous evening's tension. "Hello, sweetheart. How are you?" "I'm okay. David's been in his office all day, making calls and trying to figure out the funding situation. I think he's more worried than he's letting on." "I'm sure he is. These situations can be very stressful." There was a pause. "Mom, about last night." "Sarah, you don't need to apologize for your husband. He's under a lot of pressure and people sometimes say things they don't mean when they're stressed. But he was rude to you, and you were just trying to help." "Yes, he was rude. But I've dealt with worse treatment from people who later became valued business partners. The question isn't whether he was wrong to dismiss me. The question is whether his pride will prevent him from accepting help when he needs it most." "What do you mean?" I chose my words carefully. "I mean that sometimes the best way to prove your value isn't to demand recognition, but to quietly demonstrate it when it matters most." "I don't understand." "You will, sweetheart. You will." The next few days passed quietly. I continued my research, made more calls, and refined my strategy. I also watched from a distance as David's situation deteriorated. Through my network, I learned that 2 more potential investors had declined to fund TechFlow. The company had laid off 3 employees and was scrambling to reduce costs. Sarah called twice during this period, her voice increasingly strained, as she watched her husband struggle with mounting pressure. I offered comfort and support, but I didn't offer business advice. I'd learned long ago that unsolicited guidance was rarely welcome, especially from someone whose expertise had already been questioned. But I was preparing for the moment when solicited guidance would be desperately needed. That moment came on. A Thursday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the dinner that had changed everything. Sarah called, her voice tight with anxiety. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Of course, sweetheart." "David says he might have to shut down the company. He's applied for a dozen different funding sources, and they've all said no." He's talking about filing for bankruptcy and finding a job somewhere else. I waited, sensing there was more. But I keep thinking about what you said at dinner, about how you've been through recessions and market crashes and survived them all, about how you understand business fundamentals that don't change. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. Mom, if David asked for your help, really asked, not just tolerated your presence, would you be willing to give it, even after how he treated you? I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the moment. This was the question I'd been preparing for, the opportunity I'd been hoping would come. But it was also a test of whether I was truly the person I claimed to be. Someone who helped others despite their treatment of me. Sarah, I said softly, if David genuinely wants my help, if he's willing to listen to advice and consider perspectives he might not agree with, then yes, I would be willing to help. Really? Even after? Especially after. Because that's what family does. We support each other when support is needed most, regardless of past hurts or wounded pride. I paused, then added the crucial caveat. But Sarah, he has to ask, and he has to mean it. I won't force my guidance on someone who doesn't want it, and I won't pretend that his dismissal of me didn't happen. If he wants my help, he needs to acknowledge that he was wrong to reject it so completely. I understand. I'll talk to him. That evening, I sat in Richard's chair again, this time without the whiskey. I was too focused, too alert for alcohol. I knew that within the next few days, I would either receive a call from David asking for my assistance, or I would watch from the sidelines as his company failed. Either outcome would teach important lessons. The question was whether David was ready to learn them. My phone rang at 8:47 p.m. The caller ID showed David's name. I let it ring 3 times before answering, not out of spite, but to give myself time to prepare for what might be the most important conversation in my relationship with my son-in-law. Hello, David. Pauline. His voice was strained, exhausted. I need to talk to you. I'm listening. Not over the phone. Could we meet? Maybe at your house? I know it's late, but... Of course. Are you coming now? If that's okay. I'm in the car already. 20 minutes later, I opened my front door to find David standing on my porch, rain dripping from his hair and his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, which was probably accurate. Come in, I said, stepping back to let him enter. Would you like some coffee? Tea? Coffee, please, if it's not too much trouble. I led him to the kitchen and prepared a pot of coffee while he sat at the small breakfast table, staring out at the dark lake. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken apologies and unacknowledged need. When I placed the cup in front of him, he looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. I was wrong, he said simply. About everything I said last week. About your experience being irrelevant. About modern business being too complex for you to understand. I was wrong, and I was an ass, and I'm sorry. I sat down across from him, my own coffee untouched. Thank you for saying that. I know it wasn't easy. It should have been easier than it was. That's part of the problem. He took a sip of coffee, his hands trembling slightly. I let my ego get in the way of accepting help from someone who obviously knows more about business than I do. David. No, let me finish. Please. He looked directly at me, and I saw something I hadn't seen before. Genuine humility. I've been making calls all week, trying to find funding, trying to save the company. And every investor, every advisor, every experienced business person I've talked to has asked me the same questions you asked at dinner. Questions I couldn't answer properly because I was so focused on the technology that I ignored the fundamentals. He paused, running his hands through his hair. One guy, a venture capitalist who's been doing this for 30 years, told me I had a classic case of founder's syndrome. too attached to the product, not focused enough on the business. He said I needed to find a mentor, someone with experience, in scaling companies and managing growth. That's good advice. Yeah, it is. And the irony is that I had that person sitting across from me at my dinner table offering to help, and I was too proud and too stupid to see it. I reached across the table and touched his hand gently. You're not stupid, David. You're young and talented and passionate about your work. Those are good qualities. But they can become liabilities if they're not balanced with experience and perspective. That's what I need, Pauline. Experience and perspective. I need someone who's been through this before, who knows how to navigate the challenges I'm facing. He looked up at me, vulnerability replacing the arrogance I'd seen the week before. I need your help, if you're still willing to give it. I studied his face, looking for any sign of the condescension that had characterized our previous interaction. But all I saw was exhaustion, desperation, and genuine remorse. What exactly are you asking me to do? I don't know. I honestly don't know what I need beyond help. Maybe you could look at our business plan, our financials, our strategy. Maybe you could help me figure out why investors keep saying no. Maybe you could. He trailed off, shaking his head. I'm sorry. I'm not even sure what questions to ask. That's okay. Not knowing what questions to ask is often the first. The morning after David's late-night visit, I woke before dawn with the familiar energy that came from having a clear purpose. For the first time in months, I had a project that engaged both, my mind and my heart. David had left my house after midnight with a promise to send me TechFlow's complete financial records, business plan, and investor presentations. More importantly, he'd left with an understanding that saving his company would require more than just an injection of capital. I made my coffee and settled into Richard's office, watching the sun rise over Lake Washington while I organized my thoughts. The rain had stopped during the night, leaving the world washed clean and sparkling with possibility. It felt like an appropriate metaphor for the fresh start David and I were attempting. By 8 o'clock, my email inbox contained a dozen attachments. From David, along with a brief note. Thank you for listening last night. I know I have a lot to prove after how I acted. These documents represent everything we've built so far. I'm trusting you with the future of my company, and I hope you'll be honest about what you find, even if it's not what I want to hear. I spent the next 3 hours reviewing every document, taking notes, and building a comprehensive picture of TechFlow solutions. What I discovered was both encouraging and deeply concerning. The technology was solid, as I'd suspected. David's team had created a genuinely useful product that addressed real problems in data integration for mid-sized companies. Their software was well-designed, technically sophisticated, and potentially valuable to their target market. But the business side was a disaster. Their customer acquisition cost was nearly 3 times their customer lifetime value, meaning they lost money on every client they signed. Their pricing model was based on what they thought customers should pay, rather than what the market would bear. They had no clear path to profitability, no defensible competitive moat, and no understanding of their true market size. Most troubling, their financial projections were wildly optimistic, assuming growth rates that had never been achieved in their industry and customer retention rates that defied market reality. No wonder sophisticated investors had walked away. The numbers simply didn't add up. I leaned back in Richard's chair and considered my options. I could provide David with a gentle critique, focusing on small improvements that might marginally increase his chances of success. I could offer encouragement and hope, emphasizing the positive aspects of his technology while glossing over the fundamental business flaws. Or I could give him the truth. The truth was that TechFlow Solutions, as currently structured, was doomed to failure. Not because the product was bad, but because the business model was unsustainable. David needed to fundamentally rethink his approach to pricing, customer acquisition, and market positioning. He needed to fire half his team, restructure his technology, architecture, and completely rebuild his financial projections. In short, he needed to start over. I picked up my phone and called David's direct line. "Pauline," he answered immediately, his voice tense with anticipation. "Did you have a chance to review everything?" "I did. We need to meet in person to discuss what I found. Can you come to my house this afternoon? And David, bring Sarah. She needs to hear this too." There was a pause. "That bad?" "It's complicated. 2 o'clock? We'll be there." I spent the remainder of the morning preparing for what I knew would be a difficult conversation. I created a presentation that outlined TechFlow's problems systematically, along with potential solutions. I also researched comparable companies that had faced similar challenges, looking for examples of successful turnarounds. Most importantly, I steeled myself for the possibility that David would reject my analysis. Pride, I knew, was often stronger than logic, and young entrepreneurs were particularly susceptible to believing their own optimistic projections. Sarah and David arrived promptly at 2, both looking as if they hadn't slept well. Sarah kissed my cheek and settled onto the living room sofa, while David took the chair across from me, his posture tense with nervous energy. "Before we begin," I said, "I want to establish some ground rules. I'm going to tell you what I found, and it's not going to be easy to hear. I need you to listen completely before responding, and I need you to remember that criticism of your business model is not criticism of you personally." David nodded, though I could see him bracing for impact. "TechFlow Solutions has excellent technology," I began. "Your product works, it solves real problems, and it's well-engineered. In a different market environment, with better business fundamentals, it could be very successful." I paused, watching relief flicker across David's face. "However, your business model is fundamentally flawed. Your customer acquisition costs are unsustainable. Your pricing strategy is disconnected from market reality, and your financial projections are based on assumptions that have no basis in industry data." The relief disappeared, replaced by defensive tension. "Furthermore, your team is structured incorrectly for your stage of development. You have too many developers and not enough sales and marketing personnel. You're solving technical problems that don't need to be solved while ignoring business problems that are killing your company." Sarah reached over and took David's hand, sensing his growing distress. "The good news," I continued, "is that these problems are solvable. But the solutions require fundamental changes to how you operate, not minor adjustments around the edges." David finally spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "What kind of fundamental changes?" "You need to completely restructure your pricing model, focusing on value-based pricing rather than cost-plus pricing. You need to reduce your customer acquisition costs by at least 60%, which means changing your sales process and target market. You need to rebuild your financial projections based on realistic assumptions about growth rates and market penetration." I handed him a folder containing my analysis. "Most importantly, you need to acknowledge that this isn't just a funding problem. This is a business model problem. No amount of investment capital will save a company that loses money on every customer." David opened the folder and began scanning the documents I'd prepared. His face grew progressively paler as he absorbed the scope of changes I was recommending. "You're saying I have to start over," he said finally. "I'm saying you have to fix the foundation before you can build the house. Right now, you're trying to raise money for a penthouse when your foundation can't support a single-story structure." Sarah looked between us with growing concern. "How long would these changes take to implement?" 6 months minimum, I replied. Possibly longer, depending on how quickly David can adapt to new approaches and how committed he is to making difficult decisions. David closed the folder and looked up at me. "And if I don't make these changes?" "Then TechFlow Solutions will fail within the next 4 months, regardless of whether you find additional funding." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of harsh reality. David stared out the window at the lake, his jaw working as he processed what I'd told him. Sarah watched her husband with obvious concern, clearly torn between supporting his dreams and acknowledging the truth of my assessment. "I need to ask you something," David said finally, turning back to me. "Are you telling me this because you genuinely believe it's true, or because you want to prove that you were right about my business inexperience?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been expecting. "I'm telling you this because it's true, and because I care about you and Sarah enough to give you honest feedback rather than false hope. If I wanted to prove I was right about your inexperience, I could simply watch you fail and say I told you so afterward." I leaned forward, meeting his eyes directly. "David, I've seen dozens of companies face the exact same challenges you're facing. Some of them made the necessary changes and survived. Others refused to acknowledge their problems and disappeared. The difference wasn't intelligence or technology or market conditions. The difference was willingness to accept hard truths and make difficult decisions." David was quiet for a long moment, then asked, "If I agree to make these changes, will you help me implement them?" "If you're genuinely committed to changing how you operate, then yes. But I won't waste my time on half measures or cosmetic adjustments. Either you're willing to fundamentally restructure your business or you're not." "What would that look like?" "Your involvement, I mean." I had been preparing for this question since David's late-night visit. "I would function as an advisor and mentor, helping you develop new strategies and avoid common pitfalls. I would leverage my network to introduce you to potential customers, partners, and investors who understand the value of experienced guidance. And I would provide the kind of oversight that ensures you stay focused on business fundamentals rather than getting distracted by technical features that don't drive revenue. And in return? In return, you listen to my advice, implement the changes we agree upon, and treat me as a valued member of your team rather than an elderly relative you're humoring." David looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. When he turned back to me, I saw something I hadn't seen before: genuine respect mixed with determination. "Okay," he said, "let's do it. Let's save my company." The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of activity as David and I worked to implement the first phase of TechFlow's restructuring. We started with the most critical issue: understanding their true customer acquisition costs and developing a more effective sales process. I accompanied David to meetings with existing customers, observing his presentation style and noting areas for improvement. What I discovered was that he was an excellent technologist, but a poor salesperson. He focused on features rather than benefits, emphasized technical capabilities rather than business value, and failed to understand his customers' actual pain points. "You're selling what you want to build rather than what they need to buy," I told him after a particularly unsuccessful client meeting. "Your customers don't care about your elegant code architecture or your sophisticated algorithms. They care about solving their problems and improving their bottom line." We spent hours role-playing sales conversations, with me playing the part of skeptical prospects who demanded concrete evidence of return on investment. Initially, David struggled to articulate his value proposition in business terms, rather than technical specifications. But gradually, he began to understand the difference between what he was proud of building and what customers were willing to pay for. The transformation was remarkable. Within 2 weeks, David had closed 2 new contracts using our revised sales approach, more new business than TechFlow had generated in the previous 3 months. But the real test came when we tackled the pricing model. David's original pricing was based on development costs plus a modest markup, a formula that guaranteed TechFlow would lose money on every customer regardless of sales volume. I proposed a value-based pricing structure that charged customers based on the measurable benefits they received from the software. But that could mean charging some customers 10 times what we're charging now, David protested. Exactly. And it could mean some customers pay half what they're paying now. The key is aligning your pricing with the value you deliver, not the cost you incur. We spent a week analyzing each existing customer account, calculating the actual savings and productivity improvements TechFlow's software provided. The results were eye-opening. Some customers were receiving value worth hundreds of thousands of dollars annually while paying TechFlow less than $50,000. Others were paying premium prices for minimal benefit. This is completely backward from what I expected, David admitted as we reviewed the analysis. I assumed our biggest customers were our most profitable, but they're actually the ones where we're leaving the most money on the table. Welcome to the difference between revenue and profitability, I said. You've been optimizing for the wrong metric. We developed a new pricing structure that reflected actual value delivered, then began the delicate process of renegotiating existing contracts. Some customers balked at significant price increases, but others readily agreed when David could demonstrate concrete return on investment. More importantly, the new pricing model provided a foundation for sustainable growth. Instead of losing money on each new customer, TechFlow could now generate positive cash flow from day one of each contract. But our most significant breakthrough came when I introduced David to Marcus Chen, a venture capitalist who specialized in enterprise software companies. Marcus wasn't a relative, despite sharing David's surname, but rather a contact from my network who had a reputation for backing companies with strong fundamentals rather than flashy technology. The meeting took place at Marcus's downtown Seattle office, a understated space that reflected his focus on substance over style. I had briefed Marcus in advance about TechFlow's situation and the changes we were implementing. David, Marcus, said after reviewing our revised business plan, "This is a completely different company from the one that was pitched to investors 6 months ago. Your original projections were fantasy. These new numbers actually make sense." David glanced at me with something approaching gratitude. Pauline helped me understand the difference between what I wanted the numbers to be and what they actually were. "Smart man for listening to smart advice," Marcus replied. "Too many entrepreneurs think experience is the enemy of innovation. In reality, experience is what turns innovation into sustainable business." The meeting lasted 3 hours, during which Marcus grilled David on every aspect of the revised business model. Unlike previous investor meetings, David was able to answer every question confidently and specifically. He demonstrated not just knowledge of his technology, but understanding of his market, his customers, and his path to profitability. "I'm interested," Marcus said finally, "but I want to see 3 months of performance data using your new model before we discuss terms. If you can demonstrate consistent execution of this strategy, we can talk about Series A funding." As we left the building, David was practically vibrating with excitement. "He's interested. Marcus Chen is actually interested in funding us." "He's interested in the new version of TechFlow," I corrected. "The version that focuses on business fundamentals instead of just technology features. Don't lose sight of what changed his mind." Over the following weeks, David and I continued working together to refine TechFlow's operations. We restructured his team, letting go of redundant developers and hiring experienced sales and marketing professionals. We developed customer retention programs that reduced churn from 30% annually to less than 10%. We created partnerships with complementary technology companies that provided new revenue streams without additional development costs. Most importantly, we established metrics and reporting systems that gave David real-time visibility into his business performance. Instead of discovering problems months after they occurred, he could now identify issues immediately and address them before they became critical. The transformation was remarkable not just in business terms, but in David's confidence and leadership style. The anxious, defensive entrepreneur I'd encountered at that disastrous dinner had evolved into a focused, strategic business leader who understood the difference between activity and progress. But our greatest challenge was still ahead. 3 months after our first restructuring meeting, David received a call that tested everything we'd worked to build. Global Tech Industries, one of the largest data management companies in the world, wanted to discuss acquiring TechFlow Solutions. They want to meet next week, David told me, his voice a mixture of excitement and terror. Their corporate development team flew in from Boston specifically to evaluate us. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest. Acquisition discussions were treacherous territory, filled with opportunities for inexperienced entrepreneurs to make costly mistakes. The difference between a successful sale and a disaster often came down to preparation, negotiation skill, and understanding the true value of what you were selling. "What do you want to do?" I asked. "I don't know. 6 months ago, I would have said absolutely not. TechFlow is my baby, my vision. But now I'm not sure. Maybe this is the right move." David, this isn't a decision you should make based on emotion, either fear or greed. You need to understand what they're offering, why they want to buy you, and what alternatives you have. We spent the weekend preparing for the Global Tech meeting. I helped David research their acquisition history, understand their strategic motivations, and develop negotiation positions that protected his interests. We also discussed the emotional aspects of potentially selling the company he'd built from nothing. "It feels like giving up," he admitted, "like admitting I couldn't make it work independently. Or it could be recognizing that you've built something valuable enough that a major corporation wants to own it," I countered. "The measure of success isn't whether you hold on to something forever. It's whether you create value that others recognize and reward." The meeting with Global Tech took place on a Tuesday morning in the conference room of a downtown law firm. David and I arrived early, reviewing our strategy one final time before the Global Tech team joined us. The acquisition team consisted of 3 people: Jennifer Walsh, their head of corporate development, Dr. Robert Kim, their chief technology officer, and Thomas Brennan, their chief financial officer. All 3 were seasoned professionals with decades of experience in technology acquisitions. "David," Jennifer began after introductions, "we've been following TechFlow's progress for several months. Your technology addresses a significant gap in our enterprise offerings, and we believe there could be substantial synergies between our organizations." What followed was a sophisticated discussion of market positioning, technology integration, and strategic value creation. David handled himself well, demonstrating both technical knowledge and business acumen. But I could see the Global Tech team probing for weaknesses, testing his understanding of valuation metrics and integration challenges. The preliminary offer, when it came, was substantial: $45 million for 100% of TechFlow Solutions, including retention packages for key employees and integration support over 18 months. It was a life-changing amount of money for David and Sarah. It was also, I recognized immediately, significantly below TechFlow's actual value based on our revised business model and growth projections. "That's a generous offer," David said carefully, "but I'll need time to consider it fully." "Of course," Jennifer replied. "We understand this is a major decision. Why don't you take a week to review everything with your advisors, and we can reconvene next Tuesday to discuss terms in more detail." After the Global Tech team left, David turned to me with obvious excitement. $45 million, Pauline. Can you believe it?" "I can believe it," I said quietly. "The question is whether you should accept it." His excitement dimmed slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean that based on our financial projections and market analysis, TechFlow is worth considerably more than $45 million. They're offering you a significant discount because they assume you don't understand your own company's value." David stared at me. "How much more?" I pulled out my tablet and showed him the valuation analysis I'd prepared. "Based on conservative projections of your revenue growth and market expansion, TechFlow should be worth at least $70 million. Possibly more if you factor in the strategic value to a company like Global Tech. 70 million? His voice was barely a whisper. David, 6 months ago, TechFlow was worth essentially nothing because it had no sustainable business model. Today, it's worth 70 million because we fixed the fundamentals. Don't sell yourself short because you're impressed by a big number. We spent the rest of the week analyzing the Global Tech offer from every angle. I introduced David to investment, bankers who specialized in technology acquisitions, lawyers who understood deal structures, and accountants who could evaluate tax implications. Most importantly, I helped him understand that he had leverage in the negotiation, because Global Tech wouldn't have made an offer unless they genuinely wanted what he'd built. But what if they walk away? David asked during one of our planning sessions. What if I ask for more money and they decide it's not worth it? Then you continue building TechFlow independently, using the interest from Global Tech as validation of your business model and leverage with other potential investors or acquirers, I replied. David, you're negotiating from strength now, not desperation. That changes everything. The follow-up meeting with Global Tech was scheduled for the following Tuesday. David had spent the intervening days practicing his negotiation approach, refining his counterproposal, and steeling himself for what could be the most important business conversation of his life. But on Monday evening, something unexpected happened. That changed everything. I was in my home office, reviewing some unrelated investment documents, when my secure phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I recognized but hadn't seen in over a year. Alexander Kozlov, CEO of Synergy Systems, Global Tech's primary competitor in the enterprise data management space. Pauline, Alex said without preamble, I understand your son-in-law has developed some interesting technology that certain parties are trying to acquire. I felt a chill run down my spine. Hello, Alex. It's been a while. Indeed, I was hoping we might discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement. Perhaps dinner tomorrow evening? I'm flying into Seattle specifically for this conversation. After hanging up, I sat in the gathering darkness, considering the implications of Alex's call. Synergy Systems was larger than Global Tech, more aggressive in their acquisition strategy, and significantly better capitalized. If they were interested in TechFlow, it could completely change the dynamics of David's negotiation. It could also complicate everything in ways that David wasn't prepared to handle. I picked up my phone and called David. Pauline, is everything okay? David, we need to talk. Something's come up that could affect your meeting with Global Tech tomorrow. What kind of something? The kind that could double the value of your company overnight. Can you come over? An hour later, David was sitting in my living room, listening with growing amazement as I explained Alex Kozlov's call and its potential implications. So, Global Tech's biggest competitor wants to buy TechFlow too? Possibly. I won't know for certain until I meet with Alex tomorrow, but the timing is highly suspicious. Either this is an extraordinary coincidence, or someone at Global Tech leaked information about their acquisition interest. David ran his hands through his hair. A gesture I'd learned indicated he was processing complex information. What does this mean for my negotiation with Global Tech? It means you have options. Competition between potential acquirers almost always drives up valuation and improves deal terms. But it also means the negotiation becomes more complex and potentially more adversarial. What should I do? Looked at David, seeing in his face the same mixture of excitement and terror I'd witnessed when he first asked for my help. 6 months ago, he would have been completely unprepared for this level of complexity. But the man sitting across from me now had learned to think strategically, to evaluate options objectively, and to make difficult decisions under pressure. You should postpone your meeting with Global Tech by 48 hours, I said finally. Give me time to understand what Synergy Systems is offering. Then we'll develop a strategy that maximizes your position with both companies. And if they don't agree to postpone, Then we'll know how badly they want tech flow. Companies that are genuinely interested in acquiring you will accommodate reasonable requests for additional time. Companies that are trying to pressure you into a quick decision usually have motives that aren't aligned with your best interests. David nodded slowly. Okay. I'll call Jennifer Walsh first thing tomorrow morning. As he prepared to leave, David paused at my front door and turned back to me. Pauline, 6 months ago, I told you that you didn't understand modern business. I was wrong about a lot of things, but I was especially wrong about that. You were under a lot of pressure, David. People say things they don't mean when they're scared. No, it was more than that. I was arrogant and dismissive and ageist, I guess. I assumed that because you were older, your experience was somehow less valuable than my education. He looked out at the dark lake, gathering his thoughts. But everything that's happened since then, the business model restructuring, the pricing, strategy, the investor meetings, and now this acquisition interest, none of it would have been possible without your guidance. You didn't just help me save my company. You taught me how to be a real business leader. David, let me finish. I need to say this. He turned back to me, his expression serious and sincere. I've learned more about business in the past 6 months working with you than I learned in 4 years of business school and 10 years in corporate America. Not because the principles have changed, but because I finally had someone with enough experience to show me how to apply them correctly. I felt tears threatening at the corners of my eyes, but I kept my voice steady. Thank you for saying that. It means more than you know. There's one more thing. When this acquisition process is over, regardless of how it turns out, I want to keep working with you. Maybe we could find other companies that need the kind of help you gave me. Maybe we could formalize some kind of consulting arrangement. I smiled, remembering my conversation with Linda weeks earlier about not damaging my relationship with Sarah. I think I'd like that very much. The next evening, I sat across from Alexander Kozlov at the Sky City restaurant atop the Space Needle, watching the lights of Seattle spread out below us like a circuit board. Alex was a small, intense man in his 50s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that had built Synergy Systems into a billion-dollar enterprise. Pauline, he said after we'd ordered, I'll be direct. We want tech flow solutions. We understand. Global Tech has made an offer, and we're prepared to significantly exceed whatever they've proposed. I appreciate your directness, Alex, but I should clarify that I'm not the decision-maker in this situation. I'm an advisor to the company's founder. Of course, but we both know that your advice carries significant weight in this process. Alex leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. Synergy Systems is prepared to offer $70 million for TechFlow, with additional performance incentives that could bring the total value to $90 million over 3 years. I kept my expression neutral, but internally I was celebrating. The valuation I'd calculated for David had been conservative. Synergy's opening offer validated my analysis and gave David enormous leverage in his negotiations. That's certainly a substantial offer, I said carefully. What's driving Synergy's interest in TechFlow specifically? Their technology fills a critical gap in our enterprise platform. More importantly, their approach to data integration is fundamentally superior to what Global Tech currently offers. If Global Tech acquires them, it gives our competitor a significant advantage in a market where we currently lead. So this is as much about preventing Global Tech from acquiring the technology as it is about adding value to Synergy's offerings. Alex smiled. You understand strategic acquisitions very well. Yes, there's certainly a defensive component to our interest, but the primary motivation is the genuine value TechFlow would add to our capabilities. We spent the next hour discussing deal structures, integration timelines, and due diligence processes. Alex was clearly prepared to move quickly and aggressively to secure TechFlow before Global Tech could complete their acquisition. As dinner concluded, Alex made his final pitch. Pauline, I've been following your investment activities for years. You have a reputation for identifying value before others recognize it. If you're advising TechFlow, that tells me they're worth our attention. I'm flattered by your confidence in my judgment, Alex. But David Chen built something genuinely valuable. My role was simply helping him understand what he'd created. Nevertheless, your endorsement carries weight in my organization. If you're comfortable recommending Synergy as a partner for TechFlow, I'm confident we can structure a deal that exceeds everyone's expectations. Driving home through the quiet Seattle streets, I reflected on the extraordinary turn my life had taken in the past 6 months. What had begun as a humiliating dismissal of my business experience had evolved into the most challenging and rewarding project I'd undertaken since Richard's death. More importantly, it had restored my sense of purpose and relevance in a world that too often discounted the value of experience in favor of youth and energy. Tomorrow, I would present David with options that could transform his life and validate everything we'd worked to build together. But tonight, I allowed myself to savor the satisfaction of proving that wisdom earned through decades of experience remained as valuable as ever in the modern business world. The question now was whether David would have the courage to leverage his newfound position of strength, or whether he would accept the first generous offer out of fear that the opportunity might disappear. Based on everything I'd observed about his growth over the past 6 months, I was confident he would make the right choice. But in business, as in life, confidence was no guarantee of outcome. The next few days would determine whether our partnership had truly prepared him for the most important decision of his entrepreneurial career. The morning sun cast long shadows across my kitchen table as I reviewed the notes from my dinner with Alexander Kozlov. David would arrive within the hour to discuss Synergy Systems' offer, and I wanted to ensure I had all the strategic implications clearly mapped out before our conversation. The competing acquisition interest had fundamentally altered the landscape of possibilities for TechFlow solutions, but it had also introduced complexities that could derail everything we'd worked to achieve. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. David barely slept last night. He's been pacing around the house since 5 a.m. I think the pressure is getting to him. Please be gentle with him today, Mom. I understood her concern. The transformation, from struggling startup founder to the center of a potential bidding war between 2 major corporations, was enough to overwhelm anyone, regardless of experience. David had come so far in developing his business judgment, but this situation would test every lesson he'd learned. When David arrived, his appearance confirmed Sarah's assessment. His usually immaculate presentation was replaced by wrinkled clothes, disheveled hair, and the hollow-eyed look of someone wrestling with momentous decisions. He accepted my offer of coffee gratefully, wrapping his hands around the mug as if seeking warmth and comfort. I keep thinking this is all some kind of elaborate dream, he said, staring out at the lake. 6 months ago, I was facing bankruptcy. Now $2 billion companies want to acquire my technology. It doesn't feel real. It's real, I assured him, and it's the direct result of the hard work you put into rebuilding TechFlow's business model. Neither Global Tech nor Synergy would be interested if you were still operating under your original assumptions about pricing and customer acquisition. David nodded, but I could see the uncertainty in his expression. Pauline, I need to ask. You something and I need a completely honest answer. Do you think I should sell? It was the question I'd been expecting, and one I'd been grappling with since receiving Alex's offer. The decision involved more than simple financial calculations. It touched on David's personal goals, his relationship with his team, his vision for TechFlow's future, and his readiness to handle the complexities of integration with a major corporation. That depends on what you want from your life and career, I replied. Selling to either company would make you financially secure for the rest of your life. It would also mean giving up control of the technology you've developed and accepting someone else's vision for its future. But is it the right business decision? From a purely financial perspective, yes. Both offers represent substantial premiums over TechFlow's current valuation. From a strategic perspective, it depends. on whether you believe you can build more value independently than you could as part of a larger organization. David was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications of both paths. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of vulnerability I hadn't heard since our first serious conversation. I keep thinking about all the employees who took risks to join TechFlow. They believed in the vision I was selling, and some of them left secure positions at established companies to work for me. If I sell now, what happens to them? What happens to their equity stakes and their career development? It was exactly the kind of thoughtful consideration that demonstrated how much David had matured as a leader. 6 months earlier, he would have focused exclusively on his own financial outcome. Now he was thinking about the broader implications of his decisions. Both acquisition offers include retention packages for key employees, I reminded him, and both companies have significantly more resources for professional development and career advancement than TechFlow could provide independently. But it's not the same as building something from the ground up, is it? There's something to be said for the entrepreneurial experience, the sense of ownership and direct impact that comes from working at a startup. I smiled, recognizing the internal conflict between pragmatism and idealism that every successful entrepreneur faced at some point. David, there's no wrong answer here. Both paths offer significant benefits and meaningful challenges. The key is choosing the one that aligns with your priorities and your definition of success. Before David could respond, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Marcus Chen's number, the venture capitalist who had expressed interest in funding TechFlow's Series A round. "Excuse me for a moment," I said to David, then answered the call. "Pauline." Marcus's voice was tense with urgency. "I've been hearing rumors about acquisition interest in TechFlow. Please tell me David isn't considering selling the company just when things are getting interesting." I glanced at David, who was listening with obvious curiosity. "We're exploring all options, Marcus. Why?" "Because I've been doing deeper due diligence on TechFlow's market position, and I think everyone is dramatically underestimating their potential value. The market for enterprise data integration is about to explode, and TechFlow is positioned to capture a disproportionate share of that growth." "What do you mean?" "I mean that new regulations around data privacy and security are going to force companies to completely overhaul their data management systems. TechFlow's approach solves problems that most organizations don't even know they have yet. In 2 years, their technology could be worth 10 times what it's worth today." I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the sensation that always accompanied the recognition of a significant opportunity or threat. "Are you saying we should reject the acquisition offers?" "I'm saying David should understand what he'd be giving up. If he's willing to stay independent for another 18 months, I can guarantee Series A funding that would value TechFlow at over $100 million, with the potential for exponential growth from there." After ending the call, I sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the implications of Marcus's information. The regulatory changes he'd referenced were indeed coming. I'd been tracking them through my own investment research, but I hadn't fully considered their impact on TechFlow's market position. "What was that about?" David asked. I explained Marcus's assessment of the evolving regulatory landscape and its potential impact on demand for TechFlow's technology. David listened with growing excitement, but also growing confusion. "So now I have 3 options," he said. "Sell to Global Tech for $45 million, sell to Synergy for $70 million, or stay independent and potentially be worth $100 million in 18 months. Potentially being the operative word, I cautioned. Marcus's projections assume that the regulatory changes create the demand he expects, that TechFlow can scale effectively to meet that demand, and that no competitors emerge with superior solutions. But you think he might be right? I considered the question carefully. Marcus Chen had a reputation for accurate market analysis, and his firm's success rate with technology investments was impressive. The regulatory trends he'd identified were real and would indeed create new opportunities for companies like TechFlow. I think he's identified a genuine market opportunity, I said finally. But I also think 18 months is a long time in the technology sector. A lot can change between now and then, and not all of it would necessarily benefit TechFlow. David stood and began pacing around my kitchen, his nervous energy finally finding an outlet. This is exactly what I was afraid of. 6 months ago, I had one terrible option: bankruptcy. Now I have 3 potentially excellent options, and I have no idea how to choose between them. David, sit down. My voice carried the authority I'd learned to project in countless boardroom crises. You're overthinking this decision because you're focusing on outcomes instead of process. He stopped pacing and looked at me with confusion. What do you mean? I mean that trying to predict which option will generate the highest financial return is impossible because too many variables are outside your control. What you can control is ensuring that your decision-making process accounts for all relevant factors and aligns with your personal and professional priorities. I pulled out a legal pad and drew 3 columns across the top: global tech, synergy, and independent. Let's analyze each option systematically, looking at financial potential, strategic fit, personal satisfaction, and risk factors. We spent the next 2 hours working through a comprehensive analysis of each path forward. The exercise forced David to articulate his assumptions, identify his priorities, and confront the trade-offs inherent in each choice. The financial analysis was straightforward. Global tech offered immediate but limited returns. Synergy provided substantially higher immediate returns with performance incentives that could increase the total value. Independence offered the highest potential returns, but also the highest risk of failure. The strategic analysis was more complex. Both acquisition options would provide TechFlow with resources for accelerated development and market expansion, but would also constrain David's control over the company's direction. Independence preserved maximum strategic flexibility, but required TechFlow to compete against well-funded corporations with significantly deeper resources. The personal satisfaction analysis proved most revealing. David acknowledged that his primary motivation for starting TechFlow had been proving he could build something significant independently. Selling the company, regardless of the financial outcome, would mean abandoning that goal before fully achieving it. I think I know what I want to do, David said as we concluded our analysis. But I'm scared I'm making the decision for emotional reasons rather than logical ones. What do you want to do? I want to stay independent. I want to build TechFlow into the company I originally envisioned, not sell it to someone else to build. But I'm terrified that I'm letting pride override good business judgment. I looked at David across my kitchen table, seeing in his face the same mixture of determination and uncertainty that I'd felt countless times when facing critical business decisions. The truth was that there was no objectively correct choice. Each option involved trade-offs between risk and reward, between certainty and potential, between immediate gratification and long-term vision. David, I said gently, sometimes the most important business decisions can't be made purely on logical grounds, because the logical analysis produces contradictory conclusions. In those situations, you have to trust your instincts and your understanding of what will make you proud of your choices 5 years from now. And if I'm wrong, if I choose independence and TechFlow fails anyway, then you'll have failed, while pursuing your vision rather than succeeding while abandoning it. Different people would make different assessments of which outcome is preferable. David was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the lake where early morning kayakers were beginning their daily exercise routines. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new note of resolve. I want to decline both acquisition offers and accept Marcus's Series A funding proposal. Are you certain? No. But I'm certain that I'd regret selling TechFlow before giving it a real chance to succeed independently. The financial security would be nice, but I think I'd always wonder what might have been. I felt a surge of pride in David's decision, recognizing the courage it took to choose uncertainty over security. But I also felt an obligation to ensure he understood the full implications of his choice. If you choose independence, you'll need to be prepared for 18 months of intense pressure and scrutiny. Marcus's funding will come with performance milestones and oversight requirements that will be more demanding than anything you've experienced so far. I understand. And I'll need your continued guidance to navigate those challenges. You'll have it, I assured him. But David, before you make this final, there's something else you need to consider. What? Both Global Tech and Synergy made their offers expecting a quick decision. When you decline their acquisition interest, they're going to become competitors, rather than potential partners. They might decide to develop competing technology internally or acquire one of your competitors instead. David's face paled slightly as he absorbed this implication. You think they'd try to put us out of business? I think they'd try to neutralize the competitive advantage they were hoping to gain by acquiring you. That's not necessarily the same thing as putting you out of business, but it would certainly make your path to success more challenging. But you still think independence is the right choice? I considered the question carefully, weighing all the factors we'd discussed, against my assessment of David's capabilities and TechFlow's market position. I think it's the choice that's most consistent with your goals and values. Whether it's the right choice from a business perspective will depend on how well you execute over the next 18 months. David nodded slowly, his expression growing more determined. Then that's what we'll do. I'll call both companies this afternoon and decline their offers. Then I'll contact Marcus about moving forward with Series A discussions. As David prepared to leave, I felt compelled to offer one final piece of guidance. David, the next few months are going to test everything you've learned about business leadership. You'll face pressure from investors, competition from well-funded rivals, and internal challenges as you scale the company rapidly. I know, and I know I couldn't handle it without your advice and support. You're stronger than you realize, and you've developed better business instincts than you give yourself credit for. Trust your judgment, but don't let pride prevent you from seeking help when you need it. That afternoon, I received 2 phone calls that confirmed my concerns about the competitive implications of David's decision. The first came from Jennifer Walsh at Global Tech. Her tone was professional but notably cooler than during our previous interactions. Pauline, I understand David has declined our acquisition offer. We're disappointed, of course, but we respect his decision to remain independent. I appreciate your understanding, Jennifer. I wanted to let you know that Global Tech will be accelerating our internal development of data integration capabilities. We still believe there's a significant opportunity in this market, and we intend to pursue it with or without TechFlow. The message was clear. Global Tech would become a competitor rather than a partner. Their resources and market presence would make them a formidable opponent in TechFlow's target market. The second call came from Alexander Kozlov at Synergy Systems. His response was more direct and considerably more ominous. Pauline, I'm surprised by David's decision to reject our offer. We were prepared to be very generous in our terms. David has decided he wants to continue building TechFlow independently, Alex. I'm sure you can understand the appeal of pursuing your own vision. Of course, but I hope David understands that independence comes with risks. The enterprise software market is becoming increasingly competitive, and smaller companies often struggle to compete against organizations with deeper resources. Is that a threat, Alex? It's an observation. Synergy Systems has been considering various strategies for expanding our data integration capabilities. David's decision means we'll need to explore alternative approaches. After hanging up, I sat in my office contemplating the chessboard David had just entered. By choosing independence, he'd preserved his autonomy and potential for unlimited upside, but he'd also made enemies of 2 powerful corporations that now had incentives to prevent his success. The competitive landscape for TechFlow had fundamentally changed. Instead of facing only small-scale competitors and market dynamics, they would now be battling well-funded corporate giants with significant advantages in resources, market presence, and strategic partnerships. Over the following weeks, the implications of David's decision became increasingly apparent. Both Global Tech and Synergy began aggressively recruiting TechFlow's customers, offering competitive products at deeply discounted prices. They also started hiring senior developers from TechFlow's industry, attempting to drain the talent pool that David needed for his expansion plans. Most concerning, both companies filed patent applications that appeared designed to limit TechFlow's freedom to operate in key areas of their technology stack. While none of the patents directly copied TechFlow's innovations, they created potential legal obstacles that could slow development or force costly workarounds. David's stress level increased dramatically as these competitive pressures mounted. The confident, strategic leader who had emerged from our business restructuring process began showing signs of the anxiety and self-doubt that had characterized his earlier struggles. "I'm starting to think I made a terrible mistake," he told me during one of our weekly strategy sessions. "Maybe I should have taken Synergy's offer when I had the chance." "David, what specifically is making you question your decision?" "Everything. The customer defections, the talent war, the patent issues. It feels like we're fighting a battle we can't win." I understood his frustration. The competitive response to TechFlow's independence had been more aggressive than either of us had anticipated. But I also recognized that this was exactly the kind of challenge that separated successful entrepreneurs from those who achieved modest outcomes. "Let me ask you a question," I said. "If you had accepted Synergy's acquisition offer, what would you be doing right now?" "I'd be working as an employee in their enterprise software division, probably reporting to someone who doesn't understand our technology as well as I do. And how would you feel about that?" David was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Probably frustrated and restless. I'd have financial security, but I'd also have given up control over something I built from nothing." So the choice isn't between success and failure. It's between different types of success and different types of challenge. But what if we actually do fail? What if the competitive pressure becomes too much and TechFlow collapses anyway? It was a fair question, and one that deserved an honest answer. The truth was that failure remained a real possibility. The corporate giants arrayed against TechFlow had significant advantages and clear incentives to prevent their success. "David, failure is always a possibility in business, regardless of which path you choose. Companies get acquired and then disbanded. Corporate divisions get shut down when strategic priorities change. There are no guaranteed outcomes in entrepreneurship." Then how do I know if I'm making the right decisions? You don't. But you can ensure that your decisions are based on the best available information, aligned with your values and priorities, and implemented with full commitment to success. I leaned forward, meeting his eyes directly. "David, you've built something valuable enough that 2 major corporations wanted to own it. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because you learned to make smart business decisions and execute them effectively. With your help. With guidance, yes, but the fundamental capabilities are yours. The strategic thinking, the leadership skills, the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Those aren't things I gave you. Those are things you developed through experience and practice." David straightened slightly, some of his earlier confidence returning. "So, what do we do about the competitive pressure?" "We do what we've always done. We analyze the situation. Objectively, identify our strategic advantages, and develop tactics that leverage our strengths against our competitors' weaknesses." Over the next hour, we mapped out a comprehensive response to the competitive challenges TechFlow was facing. The strategy involved several key elements: accelerating product development to stay ahead of corporate copycats, deepening relationships with existing customers to reduce defection risk, expanding into market segments where the large corporations had less presence, and building strategic partnerships that provided access to resources and capabilities TechFlow couldn't develop independently. Most importantly, we identified TechFlow's core competitive advantage, agility and customer responsiveness, and developed tactics that emphasized these strengths while forcing larger competitors to compete on TechFlow's terms rather than their own. The key insight, I explained to David, is that big corporations are optimized for different types of competition than what TechFlow represents. They excel at leveraging resources and market presence, but they struggle with rapid adaptation and personalized customer service. So we need to make the competition about speed and flexibility rather than resources and scale? Exactly. You can't outspend global tech or synergy, but you can outmaneuver them if you're smart about choosing your battles. The strategy proved effective over the following months. TechFlow's development team released 3 major product updates, while their corporate competitors were still conducting market research. They signed partnership agreements with specialized consulting firms that provided access to new customer segments. Most importantly, they maintained close relationships with existing customers, ensuring that competitive offers were met with enhanced service and customized solutions. But the real test came when Marcus Chen's due diligence process revealed information that threatened to derail everything we'd worked to achieve. David, Marcus said during a conference call that included both of us, my technical team has identified some concerning issues with TechFlow's intellectual property position. I felt my stomach drop, recognizing the tone that venture capitalists used when delivering bad news. What kind of issues? David asked, his voice tight with anxiety. It appears that some of your core algorithms may infringe on patents held by DataCorp Systems. Our legal team believes there's a significant risk of litigation that could force major changes to your technology architecture. DataCorp Systems was a patent holding company known for aggressive enforcement of intellectual property rights. A lawsuit from them could tie TechFlow up in court for years, drain resources needed for growth, and potentially force expensive licensing agreements or technology redesigns. How did this not come up in our previous legal reviews? David asked. The patents in question were only recently granted, and the language is broad enough that it wasn't immediately obvious they would apply to TechFlow's technology, but our more detailed analysis suggests there's substantial overlap. Marcus continued with the implications for Series A funding. Peterson Ventures can't proceed with investment while this intellectual property issue remains unresolved. The potential liability is too significant to ignore. After the call ended, David sat in stunned silence in my office. The competitive pressures he'd been managing suddenly seemed manageable compared to the existential threat posed by patent litigation. This is it, isn't it? He said finally. This is where TechFlow dies. I studied David's face, seeing despair, replacing the determination that had carried him through months of challenges. But I also saw something else, a resilience that hadn't been there 6 months earlier, a foundation of business knowledge and leadership capability that could survive even this setback. David, this is where we find out what TechFlow is really made of, I said quietly. Patent challenges are serious, but they're not necessarily fatal. The question is whether you're willing to fight for what you've built. How do we fight a patent-holding company with unlimited resources for litigation? The same way David fought Goliath. We use intelligence, strategy, and agility to overcome advantages in size and resources. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts, looking for a number I hoped I wouldn't need to use. I'm going to make a call that might change everything. But first, I need you to promise me something. What? Promise me that whatever happens next, you'll remember that you've already succeeded in the most important way. You've built a viable business, developed real leadership capabilities, and proven that you can compete against major corporations. Regardless of how this patent situation resolves, you're not the same person who was facing bankruptcy 6 months ago. David nodded, though I could see he was struggling to believe it. Who are you calling? I dialed the number and waited for an answer. When the familiar voice came on the line, I felt a mixture of anticipation and apprehension about the conversation that would follow. Richard Steinberg's office. This is Pauline Turner. I need to speak with Richard immediately. It's urgent. Richard Steinberg was one of the most prominent intellectual property attorneys in the Pacific Northwest, known for successfully defending small companies against patent trolls and corporate bullies. He was also expensive, demanding, and notoriously selective about which cases he agreed to handle. But 20 years earlier, when Richard and I were building our third company, Steinberg had provided legal guidance that saved us from a catastrophic patent dispute. I'd helped him secure funding for his own law firm expansion several years later. He owed me a favor, and it was time to collect on it. Pauline? Steinberg's voice carried warmth and curiosity. It's been too long. What can I do for you? I need the best intellectual property defense you've ever provided, Richard. And I need it for someone who can't afford your usual rates. Tell me about the situation. I explained TechFlow's patent predicament, DataCorp's reputation for aggressive litigation, and the potential impact on David's funding and future prospects. Steinberg listened without interruption, asking occasional technical questions that demonstrated his understanding of both the legal and business implications. This is exactly the kind of case I enjoy, he said finally. Patent trolls need to be fought aggressively, and DataCorp has been particularly abusive in their enforcement tactics lately. Can you help us? I can do better than help you. I can make this a test case that establishes important precedents for defending against overly broad software patents. What does that mean for David? It means I'll take the case on a contingency basis, with costs covered by my firm's pro bono fund. It also means that instead of just defending against DataCorp's patents, we'll challenge their validity and potentially invalidate them entirely. After hanging up, I turned to David with the first genuinely optimistic news he'd heard in weeks. His expression shifted from despair to amazement as I explained Steinberg's offer and its implications. So instead of being destroyed by this patent lawsuit, we might actually help other companies avoid similar problems in the future? That's the plan. Richard Steinberg doesn't just win cases. He sets precedents that change how intellectual property law applies to technology companies. David stood and walked to the window, looking out at the lake where late afternoon sun was casting golden reflections on the water. When he turned back to me, his expression had completely transformed. You know what the strangest part of all this is? He said. What? 6 months ago, I would have seen this patent threat as proof that I was never meant to be an entrepreneur. I would have taken it as a sign that I should give up and find a safe corporate job somewhere. And now? Now I see it as just another business challenge to solve. Difficult and scary, yes, but not insurmountable. I smiled, recognizing the fundamental shift in mindset that separated successful entrepreneurs from those who gave up at the first major obstacle. That's the difference between reacting to problems and solving them. I learned that from you. You learned it from experience. I just helped you interpret what that experience was teaching you. As David prepared to leave that afternoon, he paused at my front door and looked back at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not gratitude or respect, but genuine partnership. Pauline, whatever happens with the patent lawsuit or the funding or the competition from Global Tech and Synergy, I want you to know that this has been the most important learning experience of my life. For me as well, David. Really? I thought about the past 6 months, the challenges we'd faced together, the growth I'd witnessed in both David's capabilities and my own sense of purpose. Really, you reminded me that experience only has value when it's shared with people who are willing to learn from it. And you reminded me that wisdom and innovation aren't opposites, they're partners. That evening, as I sat in Richard's chair with a glass of wine, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. The patent lawsuit would be our biggest challenge yet, but I was confident that David now had the resilience and strategic thinking necessary to survive it. More importantly, he had learned to see setbacks as problems to be solved rather than evidence of inadequacy. That shift in perspective, more than any specific business knowledge, would determine his ultimate success or failure as an entrepreneur. The phone rang, interrupting my reflections. Sarah's number appeared on the caller ID. "Hi, Mom. David told me about the patent situation. How bad is it really?" "It's serious, but manageable. Richard Steinberg is taking the case, which means we have the best possible representation." David seems almost excited about it. Is that normal? I laughed, understanding her confusion. It's normal for someone who's learned to see challenges as opportunities rather than threats. Your husband has developed into quite an impressive business leader. He credits you for that transformation. He should credit himself. I provided guidance, but he did the hard work of learning and growing. Mom, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you think Dad would be proud of what you've accomplished with David and TechFlow? The question caught me off guard, touching. On emotions I'd been managing carefully since Richard's death. I think he'd be proud that I found a way to use everything we built together to help someone else achieve their dreams. I think so too. And I think he'd be especially proud of how you handled David's initial dismissal of your experience. What do you mean? You could have written him off or proven him wrong in a way that destroyed him. Instead, you chose to prove him wrong in a way that helped him succeed. That takes a special kind of strength and wisdom. After hanging up, I sat in the gathering darkness, thinking about Richard and the lessons he'd taught me about leadership, patience, and the long view of success. He'd always believed that the greatest victories came not from defeating opponents, but from helping them become better versions of themselves. David's transformation from an arrogant young entrepreneur to a thoughtful business leader represented exactly that kind of victory. And the patent lawsuit, rather than being a potential defeat, was simply the next opportunity to demonstrate how much he'd learned about perseverance and strategic thinking. The real test wouldn't be whether TechFlow survived the challenges ahead, but whether David continued to grow as a leader regardless of the outcome. Based on everything I'd observed over the past 6 months, I was confident he would emerge from this latest crisis stronger and more capable than ever. The question that remained was whether the business world was ready for what David Chen and TechFlow Solutions were about to become. The morning David swallowed his pride and appeared at my doorstep changed everything. His company was hemorrhaging money, investors had fled, and bankruptcy loomed within weeks. But standing there in the rain, looking utterly defeated, he finally uttered the words I'd been waiting months to hear. "I need your help." What he didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment since the night he dismissed me at that dinner table. What he couldn't have imagined was the extent to which I'd been quietly orchestrating the very circumstances that brought him to my door. "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let him enter. "We have a lot to discuss." Over coffee in my kitchen, David laid out the full scope of TechFlow's crisis. The Johansson Group had pulled their funding. 3 other potential investors had rejected his proposals. His burn rate gave him exactly 6 weeks before he'd have to shut down operations and lay off his entire team. "I was wrong about everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About modern business being too complex for your experience. About not needing guidance from someone your age. I let my ego destroy the best opportunity I ever had." I listened carefully, noting not just his words, but his body language, his tone, the genuine humility that had replaced his earlier arrogance. This wasn't just desperation talking. This was authentic recognition of his mistakes and real willingness to change. "David," I said gently, "before we discuss how to save TechFlow, I need to tell you something. Something that will change how you understand everything that's happened over the past few months." His head snapped up, confusion replacing despair in his expression. "I've been watching your company since the day you started it. I've been tracking your progress, analyzing your market position, monitoring your competitors. When you rejected my advice that night, I didn't simply walk away and wait for you to fail. I pulled out a folder I'd prepared weeks earlier, one that contained documentation of moves I'd been making behind the scenes since that disastrous dinner. I've been quietly positioning myself to help you, even when you didn't want my help." David stared at the documents with growing amazement. Purchase orders from companies I'd recommended TechFlow to, investment opportunities I'd steered away from his competitors, strategic partnerships I'd facilitated through my network, all designed to create advantages for his company. "You've been helping me this whole time, even after how I treated you?" "I've been teaching you, David. Everything that's happened, the lost funding, the competitive pressures, even some of the client defections, I could have prevented with a few phone calls. But preventing them wouldn't have taught you what you needed to learn." The color drained from his face as the implications sank in. "You let me suffer through all of this when you could have saved me?" "I let you learn through all of this because saving you wouldn't have made you a better leader. You needed to understand the consequences of pride, the value of experience, and the importance of building sustainable business fundamentals." I leaned forward, meeting his eyes directly. "David, 6 months ago, you weren't ready to run a successful company. You had good technology and terrible business judgment. You were so convinced of your own brilliance that you couldn't see the fundamental flaws in your approach. And now? Now you understand that business success requires more than technical knowledge. You've learned to analyze problems systematically, to seek expert guidance, to make difficult decisions based on data rather than emotion. You've developed the humility that separates good entrepreneurs from great ones." David was quiet for a long moment, processing everything I'd revealed. When he spoke again, his voice carried a mixture of gratitude and awe. "You orchestrated my education. You let me think I was failing on my own when you were actually guiding me toward the lessons I needed to learn. I provided the framework for learning. You did the actual work of growing and changing. No one could have forced you to develop better business judgment. You had to choose to do it yourself." Over the following hours, I laid out a comprehensive plan for saving TechFlow. The strategy leveraged every relationship I'd been building, every advantage I'd been quietly creating, every piece of groundwork I'd been laying for months. First, we would restructure TechFlow's business model using principles I'd been trying to teach him since our first conversation. Pricing based on value delivered rather than costs incurred. Customer acquisition focused on retention and lifetime value rather than initial sales volume. Product development driven by market needs rather than technical possibilities. Second, we would tap into the network of relationships I'd been cultivating on his behalf. Potential customers who were waiting for the right moment to engage with TechFlow. Strategic partners who could provide distribution channels and market credibility. Investors who had been watching the company's progress and were ready to commit capital to a restructured business. Third, we would position TechFlow to capitalize on market trends I'd been tracking for months. Regulatory changes that would increase demand for data integration solutions, competitive weaknesses among larger companies, and emerging opportunities in sectors that David hadn't considered. "This is incredible," David said as we worked through the implementation timeline. "But I have to ask, why? Why did you invest this much effort in helping someone who was so dismissive of your experience?" I thought about Richard, about the lessons he'd taught me about leadership and the long view of success, about how true victory came not from proving superiority, but from helping others reach their potential. "Because you reminded me of myself 30 years ago. Brilliant, driven, and absolutely convinced that energy could substitute for wisdom. Because I saw potential in you that you couldn't see in yourself. And because I wanted to prove that experience, and innovation are partners, not enemies. And because you're family, I added softly. You married my daughter, which means your success is Sarah's happiness. I would never let pride prevent me from helping family when they truly need it. The transformation in tech flow over the following months was remarkable. David implemented every change we discussed, from restructuring his pricing model to rebuilding his customer acquisition process. More importantly, he embraced the role of student, actively seeking guidance and applying lessons with impressive dedication. Within 6 weeks, TechFlow had secured new funding from investors I introduced through my network. Within 3 months, they had signed strategic partnerships that provided access to market segments David had never considered. Within 6 months, the company was profitable and growing rapidly. But the real transformation was in David himself. The arrogant young entrepreneur who had dismissed my experience had evolved into a thoughtful business leader who understood the value of wisdom earned through decades of experience. He learned to balance innovation with prudent business practices, to seek advice without sacrificing his own judgment, and to treat setbacks as learning opportunities rather than personal failures. I keep thinking about that dinner, David said, during one of our regular strategy sessions, about how certain I was that your experience was irrelevant to modern business. I was so wrong about everything. You weren't wrong about everything, I replied. You were right that the business world has changed dramatically. You were right that new technologies create new opportunities. You were just wrong about thinking. That change makes experience obsolete. What I've learned is that the fundamentals never change. Understanding customers, managing resources, building sustainable competitive advantages. Those principles are as relevant today as they were when you started your first company. And what else have you learned? David smiled, the confident but humble expression of someone who had genuinely grown through adversity. I've learned that the best leaders are those who surround themselves with people smarter and more experienced than they are. I've learned that asking for help is a sign of strength, not weakness. And I've learned that success isn't just about building something great. It's about becoming someone worthy of that success. 6 months later, we sat in TechFlow's new headquarters, a modern office space that reflected the company's growth and success, discussing David's latest strategic initiative. He wanted to create a mentorship program for struggling entrepreneurs, providing them with the guidance and support that had transformed his own company. I want to do for other entrepreneurs what you did for me, he explained. There are probably hundreds of companies out there with good technology and poor business fundamentals, led by people who are too proud to ask for help until it's almost too late. It's a worthy goal, I said, but mentoring requires patience, wisdom, and the ability to teach lessons that people don't want to learn. Are you ready for that responsibility? I think so. And I think having struggled through those lessons myself will make me a better teacher. I understand the resistance, the pride, the fear that prevents entrepreneurs from accepting guidance. The program David launched became a model for how successful business leaders could support the next generation of entrepreneurs. TechFlow provided not just capital, but comprehensive mentorship, helping struggling companies restructure their operations, develop sustainable business models, and navigate competitive challenges. More importantly, the program embodied the fundamental lesson that had transformed David's own journey, that experience and innovation were partners rather than enemies, and that the greatest business successes came from combining youthful energy with mature wisdom. You know, David said as we concluded our discussion, I finally understand what you were trying to teach me that night at dinner. What's that? That dismissing someone's experience because of their age is not just disrespectful, it's strategically stupid. Age brings perspective that can't be gained any other way, and perspective is often the difference between success and failure in business. I smiled, thinking about the journey we'd traveled together from that moment of dismissal to this moment of mutual respect and shared purpose. And what will you do differently because of that understanding? I'll listen more carefully to voices I might have dismissed before. I'll seek out mentors and advisors who have walked the path I'm trying to travel. And I'll remember that true confidence comes from knowing what you don't know, not from pretending you know everything. As I left TechFlow's offices that evening, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred, not just in David's capabilities, but in my own sense of purpose and engagement. What had begun as a humiliating dismissal had evolved into one of the most rewarding experiences of my professional life. More importantly, it had proven that wisdom earned through decades of experience remained as valuable as ever in the modern business world. The tools and technologies might change, but the fundamental principles of leadership, strategy, and human nature remained constant. David's success was ultimately his own achievement, the result of hard work, dedication, and genuine personal growth. But I took pride in having provided the framework and guidance that helped him recognize his potential and develop the capabilities necessary to fulfill it. The greatest victory wasn't proving I was right about business fundamentals. It was helping someone I cared about become the best version of himself, transforming dismissal into respect and pride into wisdom. That evening, as I sat with Sarah and David over dinner, this time as partners and family rather than adversaries, I realized that sometimes the most important lessons come not from our successes, but from our willingness to help others learn from our experience. The moral of our story wasn't that age trumps youth, or that experience matters more than innovation. It was that true success comes from combining the best of both worlds, the energy and creativity of youth with the wisdom and perspective that can only be earned through time. David had learned that lesson through necessity. I had learned it through the joy of teaching someone willing to be taught. And together, we had built something more valuable than just a successful company. We had created a model for how different generations could work together to achieve extraordinary results. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.